Welcome to the latest episode of The Reporters, coming to you live inside Respectable Street Cafe, looking out the window at the bustling 500 block of Clematis Street. If you walk by, you can't miss us. Give us a wave and a hello, and then head across the street to Subculture, get a cup of coffee. Subculture is owned by Subculture Group, which is sponsoring this show. I'm Joe Capozzi. My co-host is Joel Engelhardt. And as the name of our show suggests, we're both longtime area reporters who collectively spent more than 50 years between us at the Palm Beach Post before we left in December of 2020. And we're coming up on our 2-year departure anniversary. We'll have to have a party, maybe dedicate a show to that and have some of the old editors on. Is that a good idea or not?
Well, they're going through another round of buyouts right now this month.
Oh, terrible. But Joel, tell listeners what you've been up to since you left the Post. Aside from our collaboration on the show, what do you do?
Thank you, Joe. Glad to be with you today. I am working on a website called ongardens.org, where I write about North County and Palm Beach Gardens news, trying to keep the local people informed about what's going on in their city, especially things that they wouldn't find out any other way. And that's kind of what we like to do here on the radio show, too. Joe, why don't you tell them what you've been up to?
Yeah, I kind of do what Joel does. I have a local news website. I couldn't think of a better name, so I called it my byline, byjoecapozzi.com. And it's general. It could be about anything. It's not focused to one city, but it's a lot of interesting stories that I would have been doing had I still been at the Post. And I think the Post would get to them, too, but just circumstances, the way the industry's going, they don't have the manpower that they did before. So I feel like I'm trying to fill the gaps. And it's rewarding. One of the stories I did on my website a few months ago centered on our guest today, and that's Lake Worth Beach City Commissioner Reinaldo Diaz and Melissa Landis. They were both with Lake Worth Waterkeeper. This story, you can find it on my website, byjoecapozzi.com. And it's about a unique educational program that they've recently launched. Banned book clubs for kids, young adults, to read books that are banned or that are being pulled from our shelves. It's an alarming trend that's been happening, and we're going to get into that. But before we do, and before we get into the banned books, and before we get into the obvious question on how that fits into the mission of the Lake Worth Waterkeeper, we're going to have our guests introduce themselves. So, Reinaldo, let's start with you. Give us your background. Where are you from, and how did you get here today?
Sure. So I'm Reinaldo, of course, and I actually grew up in the area. I was kind of born and raised in the Lake Worth area. And I guess the question is, how did I end up here as in my career as a commissioner and Lake Worth Waterkeeper? Well, after spending my entire life basically in the environment, I guess I was a born environmentalist. It's just kind of innate in my nature, if you will. And I spent so much time like in our different areas, but especially our local environment, and especially around the Lake Worth Lagoon. Lots of time doing that, and that culminated into probably, let's say, my first career, which is working as a guide, taking photographers and filmmakers especially out who wanted to see wildlife, especially in our waters. And so I was doing that. I was working on dive boats. I was taking people out diving, awesome wildlife encounters. I was loving it. Horrendous pay as most guide work, but I got to a point where I was like, making documentaries and stuff, it's fun. Pretty pictures are fun, and telling this story, but I wanted to do something more direct. So I somehow landed in law school and to specifically learn. I was playing different options, right? I was like, do I want to be a scientist? What do I want to do to just do more for the environment? And I settled on law school specifically to learn land use and environmental law.
So you kind of went from Crocodile Dundee to Perry Mason.
Pretty much, yeah. Like, I just wanted to do more than, take pictures and tell a story. I wanted to just be so much more direct, and that slowly evolved into my waterkeeper work.
And briefly, we're going to get to Melissa in a second, but tell listeners, give them a layman's description of the Waterkeeper, and I think there are Waterkeepers all over the U.S. You're the Palm Beach one.
Yeah, so Waterkeepers are all over the world. Actually, there's close to 400 Waterkeepers at this point. Every continent except Antarctica, pretty much, and this movement was born out of the 60s, especially out of the Hudson River. That was the first river keeper, if you will. If you've ever heard the river keeper movement, that's where it started, and it's grown to be worldwide. And each individual waterkeeper organization, we have a few different hallmarks, one of which is we're named after the watershed that we work on. So we're actually named after the Lake Worth Lagoon and its watershed, which is essentially all of Palm Beach County, from Lake Okeechobee to the Atlantic Ocean. And the Lake Worth Lagoon, its northern boundary is about PGA Boulevard down to Ocean, where Two Georges is, and down in Boynton. So 13 cities, North Palm, Palm Beach Gardens, all the way down to Boynton.
And a watershed is what?
In a watershed, so you have your water body. Our water body is Lake Worth Lagoon, and the watershed is everything that drains into that water body. So you can pick any major water body on the planet. Lake Okeechobee has its watershed, Indian River Lagoon. The simplest definition is it's everything, all the water in the surrounding area that drains into that water body. So for us, for Lake Worth Lagoon, it's very rare for government maps to end this way, but it's neat and tidy. Lake Worth Lagoon, its watershed happens to be basically like 99% of Palm Beach County.
And do you do like water quality testing yourself, or do you contract out with someone to do that stuff?
So we do it ourselves. That's one of the hallmarks of waterkeepers around the world, is we do water quality monitoring, and we do that ourselves. That's something I started early on. So our work can be categorized into 3 groups. So we do research, which is our water quality monitoring, and all science work, horseshoe crab tag monitoring, surveys, living shoreline maintenance, science in general. And then on the other side is, of course, policy reform. So I spend more time lobbying. We also collect evidence and data for for court and things like that, wherever it may be. And then bridging those two together, which we're going to talk about soon, is education, because our education reaches out to all of that work, and we're trying to connect kids of all ages essentially with that kind of work and kind of inspire them to take on more of it.
And Reinaldo, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if folks go to places like Spillway Park or Bryan Park and they're walking along the waterway and they see those signs warning about the blue algae or the green algae, and that was that you were pretty instrumental in getting those put up.
Yeah, so you'll see warning signs in some areas warning against cyanobacteria or blue-green algae. That's a whole conversation in itself, but the short version is there is no statewide law that requires these signs to be put up, or there's no policy. It's up to the Department of Health, and there's a list of what we call regulated substances. So when it comes to water, and you hear about things like you don't want arsenic in your water, and like obvious things like that. So there's a list of things that municipalities, agencies, water managers, they're supposed to test for, and conspicuously absent from that list are cyanotoxins, which are a huge environmental problem, a huge public health risk, and we deal with it regularly, especially in the western half of our watershed around Lake Okeechobee. And so through years of fighting with them to get signs, in some areas they've listened and have put some signs up, but still a lot of work to do on that.
Good, we're going to get into that some more, but now we're going to get to the star of the show, Melissa, with the band book clubs. But first, Melissa, tell us about yourself, and where are you from, where'd you go to school, and how did you wind up in Lake Worth Beach working with Reinaldo?
Oh, goodness.
That's a long question.
It's a mouthful. So I technically was born in Florida. I was raised in New Jersey, outside of Philadelphia. And so it begins. So it begins. And then I went to college in Virginia, and from there, I think the second half of my freshman year, I was a student facilitator for our college's outdoor program. And what that entailed was taking people outside, going on hikes. We went caving, backpacking, canoeing. We had a ropes course on the campus. So I very much learned how to facilitate leadership skills. And I also learned everything. I had a good introduction into what experiential education was, and that at the basis it was John Dewey with his idea of learning through experience. So we all kind of inherently know that the best way to learn is through experience. So he is said to be the father of experiential education. And that kind of stuck with me for a really long time. I ended up going back to school for adventure therapy, which is essentially experiential education married to therapy, where we could process things in the moment outside. And then I realized I didn't want to be a therapist. I worked at a treatment center down here in Florida for 2 years, and anybody working in that field gets burned out pretty quickly. It attacked you. And from there, I did get my MBA at Lynn University, and then now I am currently working on my PhD at Prescott College in sustainable education. And through that, I found a program that was started in California called Building Sense of Place. And from that, I created a program that would have been year-long to go out once a month in our watershed to help people develop a sense of place. And I needed a field guide to help me do that because I was fairly new to Florida at that time. I had moved back down here about 7 years ago. And I originally thought I was going to hire this guy to help me build up my business and my program. And it turned out that it was Ronaldo. And so from there, I ended up joining his business and Worth Waterkeeper and helping develop what is our Lagoonies program and all of our other educational pieces.
So pause real quick.
Yes.
Did you say you would go caving?
Yeah, we did.
I don't know that Floridians know it. Can you tell us about that?
It was pretty cool in Virginia. There's some good-looking caves, and people say they go to caverns and they do like a tour and everything's lit up and it's really awesome. But these caves in Virginia weren't like that. You had to get on your helmet and get on your little lamp, and you had to make sure you were dodging bats that might have been on the wall.
Sign me up.
Yeah. And you were sometimes crawling through cold water and sitting in pitch dark just to see what that was like. So we led groups of people through these caves. Caving.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that there was a thing called adventure therapy.
Yeah.
Because I joked to my wife that I take my bike on the back of the vehicle and I'll go out to the wilderness areas to ride, and that's my therapy. You know, I thought that was my inside joke, but there is a thing, adventure therapy.
There is a thing called ecotherapy too.
Wow, that's fascinating. So get into a little bit more about the educational initiatives. I know one of the more popular ones that listeners may be familiar with is the Lagoonies program. But talk about that and some of the other ones that you're behind.
Yeah, so Ronaldo started Lagoonies before I joined him. A local homeschool mother he's good friends with She wanted to do a program for her homeschool group, like a little camp. They wanted to add some enrichment into what they were doing.
It evolved into that, yeah.
Yeah.
Because at first it started with, it's a little squad of kids, if you will, and you're homeschoolers, and they're like, hey, do you want to just take us out one day and do like a little science lesson? So I would do like these one-off field trips, if you will, for lack of a better word, where we'd go to like one of our living shoreline projects where I'd take them around, show them the wildlife. We would walk around like Lantana Nature Preserve and talk about different science lessons, and then from that it evolved into a summer camp for a little bit. That's really where the name started picking up to Lagoonies, and from the summer camp, it evolved into a multi-week kind of like afternoon after school program, and then it's gone even further. And that's my full admission is I'm a guide, I'm a policy person, But one thing I'm definitely not is I'm not an educator. And I know, how, like, I've had pretty good education, I would say. I've gone to school a lot in my life. I think I've had some really good teachers, but I know, like, probably anyone listening, the shortcomings of education, how it's maybe failed us or has let us down. But so I knew something needed to be done, right? Education reform politically is always a really big issue for me, but I'm not an educator, so like I know it needs to be fixed. I have an idea of how it needs to be fixed, but the how to and the nuance, that's how we have people like, Melissa come on board and develop curriculum and really hash it out into something intentional.
Just a station identification break. You're listening to The Reporters with Joel Engelhardt from OnGardens.org and Joe Capozzi from By Joe Capozzi. And believe it or not, this episode is going to get into banned books. So keep listening. And our thank you to our sponsor, Subculture Group, which is the subculture restaurants and coffee houses throughout Palm Beach County.
Yes, and I see Rodney Mayo outside across the street. He can't hear us, but
And music brought to you by Respectables.
Anyway, that's a quick segue before we get into the books. So you're doing all this great work, and who pays for it? Where's your budget come from? What are your salaries?
So
salary.
Wait a minute, you guys get paid for this?
Yeah.
So that's always a struggle, right? And that's always a nonprofit struggle. And I've worked with nonprofits for years now, and it's always been a struggle. Right now, most of our funding comes from donations, pretty much all of it. We're working harder on incorporating more grants and grant writing. And, I wish I could say that we're doing a lot better on that, but this year has been like a banner year. It's been difficult between the tail end of like COVID pandemic and a whole slew of other issues. There's just, quite a bit going on that I feel like people are just not donating. People are super busy. They're stressed out. So it's scaled back a bit from last year. In terms of do we get paid? Every once in a while I get paid. That's usually the goal. But I do have a number of employees, and, I try to focus on having them paid first. So I haven't gotten any kind of salary, I think, this year from Waterkeeper.
Well, maybe in the beginning of the year.
Maybe in the beginning, but it's pretty nominal, I'll tell you that much.
Same.
Labor of love.
Science is expensive.
Yeah, so is education in a nonprofit sense. I mean, within Lagoonies and all the educational things I'm doing within Worth Waterkeeper, I am excited and completely appreciative of the opportunity I get to have to kind of bring some of these newer educational theories and experiences into Worth Waterkeeper and test them out in this area. Things that are being done globally that we haven't really tackled here in the United States with our public educational system. So, it is a lot of a labor of love, and it's I'm sure he'll mention it later, the David and Goliath situation where I want to change education. And this is where I start is within Worth Waterkeeper.
Yeah, so let's talk about the banned book clubs. Like, that's your latest initiative. Like, how did the idea come about? And, the obvious question, I think, is, like, what does Worth Waterkeeper have to do with banned books? And I think you started to answer that with the educational reform aspect. But it seems like, I don't know, does it feel like that's a pretty big bridge to cross?
It's a really short bridge when you...
Hold on. Hold on. I'm just, before you say your thing, because I know where you're going to go with it, but in the recent months, wanting to take Lagoonies and making more of a school environment, I wanted to create something called Minnows and Mangroves, which would have been a 3-day-a-week enrichment program more for the homeschool students. So instead of just coming to us once a week for 2 hours, it would be 3 days a week for a regular school day to kind of really focus in on the information and give more of a context and foundation for what we're doing and what we're talking about. And that didn't happen. And I don't know Maybe just people weren't ready for that type of programming, perhaps. But now we have a new base camp in downtown Lake
What
Worth.
age group was that going to be?
It would have been K through 8.
So young.
Yeah. Yep. Because we got to start young.
Minnows and mangroves, not birds and bees.
No, we wanted to keep the lagoon theme, I think.
Yeah.
But since minnows and mangroves didn't fully happened, we have a base camp. We have a place for education in Lake Worth Beach now, and we started doing programming. And one of those programs is the band book club. And then you can kind of talk about.
Somebody should tell us what that is.
Yeah. I designed 2 different classes. One was for 13 plus, because I really wanted to invite both teenagers and parents or grandparents, people from different age brackets, to come together in a safe way to talk about these harder conversations, because the books that we are picking out are on those really extensive list of being banned. And I think it's an invitation not to ban them, but to have meaningful conversations about why they might be banned, and really like the topics that those books cover. And then I was going to do a younger one for the younger ages, like K through 2nd grade, because a lot of picture books are being banned these days, and a lot of them for really interesting reasons. The first book that we did for that one was Fry Bread, which was a grandmother talking to their grandchild about the importance of fry bread to their culture. So we made fried bread.
Which culture is that?
Native culture, indigenous culture. It's a food that came out of a really hard. It's when Native or indigenous communities were pushed into the more western states, the Midwestern states, and were only given certain kinds of food. It was the introduction of flour into a lot of these indigenous communities, and so it was a food by necessity.
It's really because
why would that book be banned?
well, and that's the interesting thing, because it's the fry bread has become a really symbolic food in Native cultures, and you know, mine included, where it's not a food that's unique to any particular place, but it's a food that develops usually with stories of like extreme hardship and oppression, and
Being forced off your land.
Yeah.
being forced off your land. Even like, you know, there's a one that's similar that they kind of like independently evolve. It's like cornmeal, flour, and some sort of, you know, like butter, oil, or whatever, and you fry it. And you know, there's even there's one that like came out of Revolutionary War times, where it's like soldiers who had no rations. You know, that's what they, for whatever reason, different people come up with this recipe independently. Like in Central America, where my background is from, we have different varieties of fry bread, and that came from when Spaniards came. They came with flour, which was not something that was, you know, from our culture, but it was brought over and was worked in, and where it really came into prominence, where Melissa was touching on, was not even that long ago, a couple hundred years ago, if that. Navajo were being pushed, and if you look up something called the Long Walk, and they were pushed off their land and forced to walk south towards an area that was, you know, think Utah desert, where it's not a plain, you're not growing things. And what they were given as rations was processed flour, you know, cornmeal and sugar and things like that. So they came up with fry bread, and they survived this long walk and this change of environment.
So is it banned because it implies that someone forced someone else off land?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and it comes with like reading between the lines, because you go through the book. It's a picture book for little kids, so there's not a lot of words on it. There's a recipe in the back, and it's literally a grandma talking to her kid and like their friends. It's like a group of kids, and they're like, yeah, we're gonna make fry bread, and you know, it's really important. And it doesn't really even talk about oppression. I think there's one page where it talks about, you know, the reason why it got really symbolic, but it doesn't go into that much detail other than this bread's really important to us, so we're gonna make it.
So it sounds like a rather innocuous book, but would you have a group of second graders, third graders reading a book that talked about transgender feelings and beliefs, or what other things are they banning? Sex, open discussion of
And
sex.
race.
How do you feel?
Right.
about
Yeah. I mean,
that line?
and that's the answer to the question that Joe asked about, like, what's the bridge? And it's a really short bridge, because when you talk about things like, most people understand something like racism and discrimination down to the one-to-one level. Like, this person hates that group of people because of race. But where the connection is when we talk about systemic. And, you look at something like race, and you look at the warning signs issue on harmful algae blooms and where they choose to put those warning signs. And in that case, it's an absence of policy, or in a lot of places, there's law out there that specifically is designed, when you read in between the lines, it's intentional to almost make sure that a particular community is harmed over another community. And that's what we would call that's the definition of what we call environmental racism. So when we talk about things like systemic oppression, race relations, things like that, and even to a lot of degrees gender issues, the way that systemic oppression is carried out is through environmental law. It's through land use policy. Very famously, the way that certain communities are hurt in the past by banks was through redlining. Redlining is a very strictly land use law policy. And so controlling...
In which people could not get loans in certain neighborhoods.
Right. People...
Based on their race.
They would literally draw a red line. A municipal government would draw a red line and say, this is where the black and brown community is going to live. And then the banks are going to look at that, and it's going to be so exponentially more difficult to get any kind of funding or help that community. And it's in the same way, a community that, when you pay attention to the news, especially with hurricanes, and oftentimes it seems like, well, how come, New Orleans or South Texas, it's predominantly black and brown neighborhoods that get flooded, like, in the most drastic ways? It's like, well, because that community was planned by looking at a flood map and intentionally placing people in that way versus, other. So what we're really talking about is we're talking about controlling the narrative. So even as something as simple as fry bread, we're talking about a really systemic and intentional plan of taking out these certain things from a narrative so that these kids and people aren't going to grow up knowing that, that those kinds of questions are on the table for them to ask.
Wow. And if you can't tell by now, we are live at Respectable Street Cafe. And what was the band? What was the name of the band? That was there's a band playing tonight, and they're doing the sound check.
They're doing the sound check.
Shack something.
And they're gonna. It sounds good. I'm sure you can all hear it, and it's giving us a background. So I'm Joe Capozzi with Joel Engelhardt and the reporters. We're with Worth Waterkeeper Reinaldo Diaz and Melissa Landis talking about their wonderful organization, and more specifically, we're talking about the band book club that they recently launched. I want to rattle off a few statistics for our listeners. It's not news to you two, I'm sure. So the American Library Association says challenges to books this year reached the highest level since the association started tracing the issue decades ago. More than 1,500 titles have been pulled from the shelves. Many of them disappear secretly outside of proper protocols, without a vote, without decisions made by a body. Florida ranked second in the nation to school-related book bans with 566 in 21 different Florida school districts, and this is according to a nonprofit called PEN America. Palm Beach County is among some of the school districts in Florida that has banned books, or that has removed them and given thought to whether they should be permanently removed. And there was an interesting story in the Washington Post where they did research to show that it's all part of a Republican-led campaign to reshape public education in America. And in Florida, this ties into, the two laws that recently passed in the state, the Don't Say Gay bill And there was another measure that Governor DeSantis signed that gives parents and members of the public more increased access to the process of selecting and removing school materials. So where is this momentum coming from? I mean, I can remember growing up and I would hear that To Kill a Mockingbird would be banned, and I
Great
wondered what was
book.
in there.
Great book.
Yeah.
Lots of racism in that book.
Now it just seems like, am I being naive? Where is this coming from?
So I think like back then, books would be banned based on like controversial. Oh, they use this word, so we can't say that. But now I think what we're seeing, especially politically, is there's a shift, because what the real big concern is, you don't, if you're, and I'm an elected official, so, but, certain elected officials, if you're into something, say, nefarious, and I can definitely provide examples if you want, but, if you're somebody, and we've dealt with this even recently, where we deal with this all the time. This isn't a new issue, and both sides do it. Like I said, we're each presenting a narrative, right? And I do that myself, where in court or even to Palm Beach Post, and like I said, I used to do photography, filmmaking, so I would do that. I'm telling a story, so I pick the environmental issue that I'm working on, I make my story, I present it, and that's my case. This area of the lagoon needs to be protected because of this environmental harm. Here's the documentation, blah, blah, this and that.
So you're saying you're making an argument.
Right, we're making an argument. And so that comes with, a process of like scrutiny. You can get scrutinized, people can ask questions, you have to make your argument, you have to plead your case, and so on and so forth. So we do that, and we're prepared to do that. But if you're on the other side, and if you're on the side where the evidence is against you, it's in your best interest to have a population that isn't going to ask really pointed questions, right? You mentioned Governor DeSantis, and he's a constant battle for Florida environment, even though he has this really good narrative surrounding him that he's good on water and good on Everglades issues, because that's what he ran on, and he's coasting on that momentum. In the beginning, he did great stuff where I and others asked him, let's replace the board at South Florida Water Management District. The previous one is awful. You guys need to do more on harmful algae blooms, especially cyanobacteria in Lake Okeechobee. So let's do more. So he, very correctly put together the Blue-Green Algae Task Force. Great. Here's our proposed, experts. Dr. Tom Frazier, I love him. He's an awesome scientist. Let's listen to what he has to say. He gets on there. I spend countless hours, over 100 hours, proposing recommendations. Yeah, what if we did this? What if we did the regulated systems, regulated substances list and policy changes, this and that? That report makes it up there, and then it fizzles out. Nothing actually happens. And because what's actually happening is he's controlling his own narrative, because he wants to be popular. He knows that water is a top issue in Florida, so he'll do everything he can to protect that image. Doesn't necessarily translate into the work that actually needs to be done. And the problem is, it's not just government, it's other, environmental organizations. It's kind of, everyone has this argument, this narrative, this story that they're trying to tell, and it doesn't always vibe together. And some of it is pretty sketchy, and if people start asking questions, then that popularity wanes, right? So like, he runs on being really good on water and being anti-big sugar, except when you start looking into his history and who his policy directors were. And for years, at one point, his literal chief of staff, his number one go-to for policy change, was this guy, Adrian Lucas, who is the son of Sol Lucas, who happens to be, strictly coincidental, right? He happens to be the number one lobbyist for like Florida crystals and other big sugar. So like, do me, a waterkeeper, do I have a chance in proposing a water quality policy or some kind of measure when I have to go through Adrian Lucas, when I spent so much of my career being anti-big sugar and anti-political corruption, and the one guy that I have to go through to get some policy through is the son of their top lobbyist?
Can you rise in the ranks of Palm Beach County or Florida politics if you are anti-sugar?
I don't think so. I think if you look at I mean, that's such a loaded question. I mean, I think it's very difficult. Like the history of Palm Beach County, and we need the sugar industry. That's not what this is. Like we need our agriculture engineering. Right, but some of their practices and some of the things, especially politically, have just been pushed down out of view, where people aren't asking the right questions about it. And the way that they get pushed down is you design an education system that you're not training people to ask those questions, right? And then on top of that, you're going to pull out those books. You're going to pull out the books that give people those tools to be like, oh, wait a minute, quintessential, we started with 1984. Maybe I'll let Melissa explain why that book was the first one.
And we didn't start with that one.
Which was our first book? Our first band book?
It was, oh gosh.
Fahrenheit 451.
Yes,
Never mind.
the book burning.
Yeah, that's coming up. Fahrenheit 451, which is literally about banning books and why they ban books. And it's about they ban books because they don't want people.
Books.
Yeah, they literally burn them in that regard, obviously, and they burn them because they don't want the population to be miserable and ask questions. They want them to be happy. Life is going great.
That reminds me of. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
That reminds me of the invention of the printing press. Before the invention of the printing press, the Catholic Church controlled all the information to the people, and there was one religion. But once the word could be read and studied, people started coming up with different interpretations and their own religions, and the church has been riven, split ever since.
Right.
They tried to keep control back then, and there's been efforts to control books and intellectual discourse ever since.
Right. Cambridge Press, right? That's how they started. And it's like whack-a-mole, and they're undertaking this mission of trying to really strictly control a narrative by banning these books. And I think the analogy we talked about earlier that was really good was a research paper, right? We're researchers, we're doing science, we're doing law, and we're presenting our papers and our reports. And it's like, remember the old card catalogs, and you have these little drawers, and instead of having a complete card catalog with all the information, they're going and they're pulling drawers out and making them not available to people.
Pull drawers.
Yeah, and we're not saying that, you have to pick one side over the other. We're saying just that act of pulling those drawers out, just the act of pulling out information, you're preventing people from developing into, the best word to describe it is scholars.
Should kids be able to read anything they want to read?
So I don't know if it's necessarily about that. I think, going back a little bit, it's more like the hot button word is indoctrination. We're going to indoctrinate our children. And the funny part to me is that we're under the assumption that they're not already indoctrinated. Like if we think about our history books and our education system, they've already been selective on what history we're putting and what we're giving to kids. So all throughout their education, we're already giving them like piecemeal of what history is and what culture is and all these things. So we've already been doing that over the years. So now that people are tired and they want to see books that better represent themselves and tell their stories and acknowledge their narratives, now they're calling it a reform of education that doesn't even make sense. So you've already been doing that for generations. Like our educational system hasn't changed since the Industrial Revolution. And now that people are starting to like figure it out and want other narratives to be heard, that's more of what it's about. So books are being written for children, so they have a reference. Maybe a toddler has two dads, and now there's a book that talks about this other child, like whatever that child is. Yeah. And Tango, that was one of the books I was going to do. And Tango Makes Three is about two male penguins having this little baby penguin together. So.
And kids sometimes do have two dads.
Exactly. Exactly. So like.
Or two moms.
they're writing books that better demonstrate who they are and their population. There's a ton of books now. A really good bookstore is right here in downtown West Palm Beach, Rohi's Readery. And she's done a really good, Pranu is her name. She's done a really amazing job of having all books in her bookstore that are written by the Black or Brown community. And
You need to tell our readers where that is.
Yeah, it's in Rosemary Square.
The square.
The square, yes.
Yeah.
Across the street from where Cheesecake Factory
Yeah.
is?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
So she's done amazing work. A lot of her stuff is about social justice, which essentially at the end of the day is what we're talking about, and that's kind of how it fits into Lake Worth Waterkeeper. Is I read a book recently, and the author he published it in 1971, and he said, basically, my thesis is that all education is environmental education. And so when we're doing book banning, we're talking about narrative. So all narratives are environmental narratives. So when you start taking away these books, what are we telling our kids? We're not exposing them that there are different kinds of people on this planet or other cultures that we need to acknowledge. So at every age, even if every kid should be able to see books that represent who they are, and have that option. And for those kind of books, it's really, again, an invitation for parents to have meaningful conversations with their children. I think a lot of it has to do with fear, the book banning. So when we're taking away books, it's based on fear, and it's based on parental fear and adult fear and misunderstanding, and all we're doing is passing it on to the next generation, that same fear, which means we're perpetuating the same types of things, hate and racism, all those kinds of things.
Joe, can you reintroduce our guests?
Yes, that is Melissa Landis. She's the educational coordinator.
Yeah, the education director, yeah.
Director for the Lake Worth Waterkeeper, and with her is the Lake Worth Waterkeeper, Reinaldo Diaz, who is also a Lake Worth Beach City Commissioner. Different
roles. I'm also on the board of Florida Wildlife Federation, Everglades Coalition. I'm also on the steering committee of Lake Worth Lagoon Initiative. So it's all different things, but very related.
Everything's related.
Everything's related, shockingly, and it's all comes down to environment, right? We talked about land use and how systemic racism is usually carried out through land use law and environmental law. Or that, the Tango book is really a great example, because one of the top things we often hear about gender and sex and gender is that you hear, oh, that's not biology. In biology, there's two genders, which is wrong. One of the things I studied in undergrad was anthropology, so it was communication and anthropology in undergrad. And anthropologists knew for eons that depending on cultures, the number of genders change. There's a difference between sex and gender. They're two different concepts. And even biologically, what we know biologically, or what some people apparently understand as biology, they completely misunderstand. Penguins, quahog clams, snook. There's loads of animals like penguins and all kinds of animals throughout the animal kingdom that'll do same-sex pairing. A lot of wading birds in Florida do that, especially in response to mercury exposure and things like that. The changing of genders, that is super common and is done by a lot of animals, especially in our water, and snook, Goliath grouper, clams. There's so many species that on a whim they'll change their gender just for various reasons. So on its face, they're going in with a big misunderstanding. Why should they read this book when it's not it's not biology and blah blah? Except it is biology, and it's very well documented biology, very well researched stuff, and they're all trying to discount it and trying to take it away because it doesn't fit their narrative.
So how many times has the book club met so far?
Just once.
The once.
So next Tuesday coming up, we are going to talk about Lord of the Flies.
Ah, and a great one.
What kind of turnout do you get?
For the first one, it was small. We had a group of about 5 people coming together, but hopefully more people will come out.
I think you need to tell us where and when.
Yeah, it is at our base camp in downtown Lake Worth. Would you like the address as well?
Yeah, say the address again.
It's 111 North M Street.
Wait a second. 111.
111.
How can you not memorize
I
that?
know.
Amazon Mom.
Yep,
Yeah.
M Street.
You're just north of the city library, I think.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So I go there a lot.
Have you gotten complaints? Has any one of you tried to shut you down?
Not.
What are you laughing
Yeah, I mean,
How does the rest of the Lake Worth City Commission feel about that?
Well,
I guess no one's really.
I
from the
mean,
commission
it's
has
not.
said anything.
It's separate from commission work. I think Lake Worth as a whole has always been a very progressive,
Yes.
very accepting town.
Eccentric.
Yeah.
Keep Lake Worth weird.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. And so, I think being based there is natural. But, watershed wise, Palm Beach County wise, there are times where, people are pretty open and saying that, oh, we support your environmental work, but, you're indoctrinating kids and we can't agree with that or whatever it may be. And that comes from multiple sides, right? I've had comments of one of the things we do for our Lagoonies programs is we take kids out fishing because that's a huge part of my culture that I grew up with. Like I, live off the ocean and the plants that we grow and so, but I've had groups come in and say, they think it's not appropriate to take animals out of the ocean and we're using fishing line that's monofilament and plastic based and whatever, and they call the sustainability into question of that practice. And the way I look at it is like, well, one of the big things that we try to focus is this indigenous knowledge in the different cultures, and it's like, well, I feel like we had that kind of figured out for a long time, living off our ocean here without any kind of environmental issues. It was really until, like, dare I say, capitalism and other things came into play that really changed the game. So we're, that's the thing, and we're not here saying that any one thing is this is what you have to be, and in order to be a good environmentalist, you have to do X, Y, and Z. That's not what this is. They're trying to take books away and learning away. We're trying to say, you guys got to look at it all and figure out what works for you. Because, not everyone is going to be able to eat just fish that they catch. Not everyone's going to want to be vegetarian or vegan or whatever it may be. And that's okay. That's not our message. We're like, if you want to use straws or cups or whatever, that's fine. That's not our message. Our message is do what you can and, learn from the information that's available to you.
So just to be clear, have you gotten real pushback? Like phone
there's
calls or an email? Or
there's one notable email. There was there was a little bit of feedback but he talked about the fishing line was one of the pushbacks for that. But with the one email, it was what he said is that we support environmental work and saving the Lake Worth Lagoon. However, we don't believe in your social justice agenda and your indoctrination of children.
There's that word again.
Yeah.
I know, and I don't entirely know what part of our programming that he was opposed to. I don't know how you separate saving the environmental from social justice issues. Again, everything is environmental. There's always this idea of categorizing or separating businesses or topics. Even in school, we have different subjects and they're all kind of separated, but who's talking about how everything's connected? Yeah. And so you can't disregard social justice and only focus on the environment. That doesn't work.
Yeah, it doesn't fit in a neat box. And again, it comes down to that misunderstanding. And I think there's kind of indirect or things that aren't as noticeable in terms of fundraising. We do stick our neck out there. We are saying, quote, controversial things for Florida. And realistically, there are organizations who work in Everglades things who, they run a tight ship and they're very strong and very influential on who they consider to be their close partners. And if we, take too much time to stand up to government and our governor, or we point out some of the things that are happening to some of our scientists being censured and things like that, then I feel like we tend to get a little bit ostracized, especially by like the bigger donors who are closely knit to this, politically influential and, the bigger guys. I think Melissa said it, like the David versus Goliath thing. Sometimes the Goliath isn't just polluters or developers or government. Sometimes the Goliath is another organization who does good work, and they are relatively mostly on our side, but in certain ways they're not as supportive of us because of how controversial we can be.
I think the Goliath isn't necessarily all those things. It's the paradigm that we've created. So everything that we see, everything we do, we created our systems because of the way we see things or the way we view things. And in order to change anything that is systemic, it's through changing the way we see or do things. And that's one of the hardest things to do, is to change paradigms.
It's a big reset.
But if you look at yesterday's election results, or Tuesday, you would see that the paradigm is shifting in a different direction.
You're gonna have to go there, Joel, right? I think that's the thing. We're putting this out there because the rest of the country seems to be going that way. I think there's a really strong holdout in Florida. I, of course, am really politically involved, so that's a whole other show. Is the failures of political organization in Florida and why we're not stepping up to the plate. And again, it comes down to kind of what we started with. It's like, there's this really controlled narrative, and the people who are often doing the most harm, they have a really good PR team. They're out there, they know the data, they know how to literally change the maps. Look at Doug Lawson and how he lost. It wasn't because of, he's a popular guy in his area. It was because of gerrymandering why he got kicked out. And these maps on its face, they look unconstitutional, and they're being challenged constantly, and it's a constant problem that we're dealing with. But the other problem that we're dealing with is, while they're doing that stuff, it's like, playing with the infant. They're jingling the keys over here. They're doing the heinous stuff over here and saying, look, I'm the head of the statewide agency that protects wildlife, and look at all the good I'm doing. But that, they're jingling the keys of doing that. But then the heinous stuff is they're destroying the environment. They're not taking action. They're doing things that support polluting and developer industries.
Trying to build on submerged land?
Yeah, like, dare I say, like Munyon Cove, and if you really want to.
Munyon Cove?
So that's an area in Lake Worth Lagoon that I have a really strong connection to, because it's a really good fisheries. It's a nursery ground for things like bonefish, permit, snook, and I see the time. And but it's a really important area, really great wildlife encounters. But the thing is, this is the holdout in all of the Lake Worth Lagoon. This is where the best seagrass is, and that's by Lake Worth Lagoon standards. It's not great, let me put it that way overall. But it's the holdout area, and there's a row of properties that a few of them, they're all privately owned, submerged land. A few of them are owned by these developers that are threatening to literally fill in that seagrass, destroy the seagrass, put in marinas and condos. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to attach a development project to this submerged land that otherwise won't be worth a lot, because you can't build on things that have protected seagrass. But if they're successful in attaching these development plans to it, they can turn around to their friend, Governor DeSantis, and say, hey, I have this property. 6 years ago, I bought it for $400,000, but I attached this 300-unit condo in Marina. Now it's worth $30-40 million. But I don't want to build it. I'm a really environmentally friendly guy, so I'm going to sell it to you for a bargain for $20 million.
This is off of Singer Island?
This is off of Singer Island. This is south of MacArthur Beach State Park. And one of the owners is Rodney Barreto, who happens to be the chairperson of Florida Fish and Wildlife. The agency that's
welcome to come on our show.
The agency that's tasked with protecting our manatees, our sea turtles, our fisheries. He also sits on, and I won't call him out, but he also sits on the board of other environmental organizations that I think do pretty good work. Except, if this organization is looking to protect something like a bonefish nursery, Munyon Cove is a bonefish nursery.
Who eats seagrass?
manatees,
turtles.
green sea turtles, and it's not just eating them; it's it's its habitat, everything that lives among it, and it's so critically important to protect it because I grew up a fisherman and diver, and all the things we like to see, my favorite fish to catch on, like I'm a big fly fisherman. And snook, especially for Lake Worth Lagoon, that's like our fishery, right? That's the thing that Lake Worth Lagoon does best, and that's their home base, right? A few weeks ago, we were out surveying for horseshoe crabs, and I'm swimming through the mangroves, just like photographing the mullet run because that was fun while it was happening, and I got taken aback because I saw a small school of juvenile permit. These fish are like their own economy in places like Biscayne Bay, and having those nursery grounds in a place like Lake Worth Lagoon, it's monumental and it must be protected. There's no compromise in protecting Lake Worth Lagoon. There's no compromise in protecting the Everglades, and that's where our controversy lies. Is too many groups out there, if they ask for $1 and they get 50 cents, they're happy with that, and they're like, well, we're grateful. We don't want to ruin our chances to get the rest and whatever. It's like, but we're never getting that extra 50 cents. So we should make it a point to say we get $1 or nothing, or we get $1 because that's the right thing to do, and there shouldn't be any compromise. Because if the environment is the only side going towards the middle, then it's not a compromise. We're just losing because the other side is not meeting us halfway.
Yeah.
This is great. I feel like we could keep going for
I
another
know.
hour.
That's what
I keep
happens.
thinking of more questions I want to
And
bring
at
up.
Subculture Radio, we can.
Yeah.
But yeah, we got 5 minutes left for our time. But tell listeners how they can get more information. What is your website, number one? And if people want to donate to your cause, how can they do that?
You can go to lwwk.org, and we have a lot of information on our website. You can donate through the website. That's always great. We're also currently doing a big drive to look for, especially like corporate sponsors or businesses that are, otherwise connected to the work we do. If you work on, if you're hospitality, you need tourism, you're boat builders, fishing, whatever, anything on the water, anything that's remotely related to the work that we do, we would love to have, monthly sponsors.
Yeah.
And of course we welcome that with individuals as well.
And we're having our first annual fundraiser dinner December 4th. So that is also on the website in Lake Worth Beach at the public library, actually.
At the library.
Yeah, it'll be a nice, intimate first dinner together, but it's a really cool building, and we want to support our local library as much as possible. And
your next
The
session
band.
on books is what book and when?
Lord of the Flies on this coming Tuesday, actually at 7 p.m.
One of my favorite books.
North M Street.
Yes.
Tuesday, November.
This Tuesday.
This coming Tuesday. What's the date of that?
Yeah.
Oh.
I don't remember the date.
November 18th. No. Today's the 11th.
Yeah.
With elections
Today's
and hurricanes.
November
on
I
the-
know.
Today's November 11th, and you're
So it's the
listening to
15th.
reporter.
It's the
15th.
15th.
Yeah.
November
November
15th is the
15th,
next one.
2022.
Yes.
And,
after.
and definitely check our website because our calendar has so much. We have like living shoreline maintenance days where we take you out and help us. It's not just a cleanup. We often have to fix things on our living shoreline, pull out invasives,
Plants, mangroves.
plants, all kinds of things. We have our horseshoe crab tagging, which we'll pick up again in the spring, and that's always a really good adventure.
And are you still doing the adventure? We did the adventure hike north of Riverbend, and we did the paddling.
Yeah, and every once in a while, we'll have we're always working to build on our membership programs and events like that, but we're definitely looking for more things like that. Week of Giving, we're gonna have a lot of events that are similar to that. It'll all be on our calendar. There's something every week at least.
Fantastic show. Thank you both for being on. Reinaldo Diaz, Lake Worth Waterkeeper, with Melissa Landis, the educational director for the Waterkeeper. And please go to their website, support them. And this is
the reporters.
The Reporters with Joe Capozzi.
Joel Engelhardt from OnGardens.org and
Joe Capozzi. And
from BuyJoeCapozzi.com.
And if you're downtown, come by Respectable Street to see the legendary Shack Shakers. The legendary Shack Shakers. I think the doors open at 8:00, and you had a little taste of them earlier.
They were definitely shaking us, so it was appropriately named.
So thank you, everybody, for listening. We really appreciate you being here. And we hope we'll catch you next week, 5 o'clock on Friday.
Same bat time, same bat channel.